Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Patty Limerick from the Center of the American West, and I am so grateful to you for coming tonight. This is the first in what will be at least a 3-year series on bipartisan friendship. And yes, when I say that, some people say, can you keep that going for 3 years? Or is the population there? So I do believe it is. I think it is possible. In the program, you see me quoted as saying, in print, even in these polarized times, the American West is still the home of robust and resilient friendships that cross the boundaries of party and policy preference. I think that is true, and I think we will keep this series going for years, but I asked everyone here, I commissioned all of you to help me out. Everyone here is now charged with the mission of scouting to search the West for robust and resilient bipartisan friendships. And to, I guess the technical term is, and you are to finger the people you find, I guess. You're supposed to kind of turn them in to me at that point. We would only do this with their consent, of course, so that's important. I'm very happy tonight to be joined by the co-founder of the Center of the American West, who is actually the one and true founder of the Center of the American West, since he stuck with the program and did the paperwork, all the paperwork, in the late 1980s when I became fatigued and said it was too much trouble to found a center. So, every year in the holiday season, I give Charles Wilkinson a nicely written thank you note for bringing the center into existence, and he will get his 2019 thank you card at lunch on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday. But at this moment, I'm going to ask everyone here to join me, all of you who have ever done anything with the Center of the American West, please join me in expressing gratitude for the fact that the Center of the American West exists. And please join me in a prolonged round of applause. There are not enough mental health counselors in the nation to have helped me if I had had to stay in a conventional academic world. I'll just say that. So this is an incredible act that all of humanity has benefited from by not having me nattering on the streets in a disruptive manner. So anyway, all good. So please now, just quickly, if you wouldn't mind turning to the back of your programs, looking at upcoming events. At the very beginning of upcoming events is an interesting one called Shoebox Stories. And given that first one is only a little more than a month away, and it does take up the cause of empathy and engagement across boundaries, I hope you would join me. Please consider joining me on January 15th at the Modus Theater event in the Dairy Center, where we will hear 4 fraternity presidents, CU fraternity presidents, who will be lending their voices to the dreamers, that is the DACA students who were raised in the United States but brought here when they were children and who may be subject to deportation, depending on decisions coming up. This is an evening in which the fraternity fellows have been, sadly we found ourselves in an unfortunate habit of referring to them as the frat boys, and we thought, that's not right, so we call them our fraternity gentlemen, because that is in fact the right term. And the fraternity gentlemen will be reading from these very moving stories, and we are grateful to our partners in that event, those fraternity guys. Now, an important reminder, the event tonight is not orchestrated as a Vulcan mind meld or a group hug. Right. Well, or maybe wrong, I don't know, but we'll find, they'll do whatever they choose. And if Dr. Spock and Vulcan mind meld comes into their world, that's fine. To start the discussion, we will indeed hear the story of the origins, growth, and persistence of the friendship between these 2 accomplished public servants. But then we will turn to topics on which they will, as the program says, agree, disagree, and half agree, but with their friendship remaining steady and unshaken as it has for years. So, quick question. How many of you came to hear Mark Udall and Bob Beauprez? Okay, that was the clearest majority. So, no question. Okay, to make that work, we have to take a moment for the ground rules, because this is not a Vulcan mind meld or a group hug. You are certain to hear opinions and positions with which you disagree. As usual, we encourage you to express your dismay or discontent or disagreement, but as usual, we ask you to follow the Center of the American West's remarkable, distinctive custom of respiratory protest. That is, when you hear a statement with which you disagree, you should feel free to express your feelings, but we ask you to use respiratory protest. Snort with contempt, sigh with exasperation, gasp with disbelief, In other words, let off steam, but don't prevent your neighbors from hearing the speakers. So, I actually have no idea why that hasn't caught on nationally. That just seems like maybe not the cure for our problems, but a step in the right direction. So we do have written, if we are going to, we probably have so much that these folks are going to be talking about that we probably will not have questions, but if we do have questions, they would be written on index cards. So if you didn't pick up an index card and you would like one, show a certain at sea-ness or distress or something, and someone from the center will bring you a card. Kurt is walking around, and I think Ronnie is going to be walking around too, so you can get those cards and little pencils if you'd like to write a question. There are short bios of our two principal figures here in the program, and there is a significant amount of autobiography and reminiscing in your immediate future, the conversation we're about to start. So I will not in any way summarize these complicated lives, but I will just say for now that in 2002, Bob Beauprez was the first representative from Colorado's Congressional District and was reelected in 2004. And Mark Udall served 5 terms in Congress as the representative of Colorado's 2nd District, and then he was in that office from 1999 to 2009, and he went on to become United States Senator from 2009 to 2015. So to sum that up and to get these folks chatting, I will quote the wonderful fellow who appeared at my home last night to replace my suddenly non-functional thermostat and to save me from a very cold night, and who, when I showed him the postcard announcing this event, you guys, I mean, you would have loved this moment, because, okay, so I show him the postcard, he looks at the card, he says, oh, I grew up in Colorado, he says, I know those two. Those are both good guys. The fellow replacing the thermostat was clearly a good guy himself, so the statement carried the authority usually summed up in the saying, it takes one to know one. So we'll get them chatting in a moment, and before I sit down, though, I want to say that we are very fortunate to have a number of regents with us. We have Regent Leslie Smith and Regent Linda Shoemaker, and perhaps you'd like to stand. Sure. And we have a number of former regents. We have Regent Pete Steinhauer, and we have Regent Steve Bosley, and Regent Michael Kerrigan, and maybe they should stand too, because they are seasoned and weathered veterans, and they are here tonight. And then if you are sitting next to a dignitary, and I have not recognized that person, could you point to the dignitary next to you? Just so that we will know that they're, well, perhaps not. So, okay. There's somebody asking for an index card up here. I'll just point that out. And then, ladies and gentlemen, join me in one of my happiest moments at the Senate of the American West in presenting Congressman Mark Udall, Senator Mark Udall, and Congressman Bob Beauprez. So we are going to begin with the story of the friendship. And we will then go, after we have heard the story of the friendship, we'll go to some various dimensions of the time you were in office and things that you observed about political context at that time. But for the first few minutes, it's just full out, tell us how you got to be pals.
Full confession, to start the story, in 2002 there was the initial campaign to decide who the congressman or congressperson would be from the 7th Congressional District, the newly created district. My candidate was Mike Feely. He lost that race by, I think, 126 votes. Nobody was, 121.
I remember.
And Bob remembered, and I think it took a number of weeks, 5 weeks, before Bob was sworn in. But I grew up with role models who believe that you campaign hard, you punch the other team and the other candidates as much as you can. But when the election's over, then you're on the same team. You're representing a state, you're representing a country, and in the long run, you want to have an alliance, and you want to get, in order to have an alliance, you've got to get to know each other. So and I had role models who showed me that way. So I reached out to Congressman Beauprez and suggested we get together and hold a joint town meeting. The city of Arvada had been in my district, but the district had been adjusted. In fact, I thought I'd gone to heaven, Bob, because I ended up with half the ski areas. And Arvada was one of the towns that had been removed from the district. But I got to know people in Arvada and had affection for Arvada. So we held a town meeting in Arvada at the Arts Center down there. And our teams stood us on the long distance apart on the stage, right? You were probably on the right side, I was on the left side. And immediately, the audience, without even listening to somebody like Patty set the stage, began throwing epithets, crude comments, very disrespectful comments at Bob. I thought it would settle down. I think we each fielded a question, and it continued. And it had to do a lot with the Iraq War, a very controversial situation. And I voted against the war. Bob had made it clear, and that's a simplistic way of putting it because of the ways in which the Congress considered what President Bush wanted. Bob had been, I think, full-throated support. And so we had different positions. But I just felt it wasn't furthering the discussion to have this kind of a dynamic beginning to develop. So what did I do? I walked across the stage to Bob and I said, we're both representing Colorado. We both worked hard to win our seats. We both want to represent the state as best we can. But I'm going to stand with Congressman Beauprez here, and we'll field questions together. And I maybe let Bob comment as well. But that was the start of our friendship.
Well, and how can you not have respect for somebody that does something that magnanimous? I mean, it's just almost, in the environment we're living in today, unfortunately, it's almost hard to comprehend that a Democrat and a Republican could have that kind of a friendship, even though you see an issue that hot and that big and that important. It can't get much more important than that. Even though you see it differently, that you'll stand shoulder to shoulder. What Mark left out was, as luck would have it, the war broke out 3 days before that town hall. So people were a little agitated. And Mark and I and my wife Claudia and Maggie, I know they were there, and we had a good security force. Arvada's finest escort us out, but that is how it started. And I certainly knew Mark before. I don't know if you knew anything at all about me, other than I was the guy running against Mike Feely. But we soon bonded, and then when I did get sworn in, I think it bears mention, another tribute to my friend Mark. We thought we had a good staff that we put together, but a lot of that really was modeled after some advice we got from your staff. I don't know if you realize that or not.
I do remember that.
But your
that
chief
was
of staff
the
and my chief of staff became very good friends, and all the how-to questions that you have when you come to a place like the United States Congress for the first time, we were visiting with your staff. A couple years later, we went to Iraq together on one of those Codels and congressional delegation trips. And that just, if we weren't already cemented as respectful friends, colleagues before, we certainly were after that. And I know you hear about those kind of trips, and some of them get a little excessive. The ones we were on were not that way. And I think that's maybe what's missing today, is a chance, when the cameras aren't on and nobody's really watching other than you're just with the guys, with your colleagues. And that trip to Iraq, we were just reminiscing about it beforehand. Those kind of opportunities, I think, are invaluable, and I wish we had more of those. I think the environment now has become extremely impersonal. Maybe that's too flattering. It's become extremely antagonistic now. I win, you lose, and whatever it takes to get there. And I'm afraid too much of society, Patty, is that way now too. So. Mark and I always had great respect for each other. You look up at the big board where it records all the yeas and nay votes, and we often voted differently, and still have this kind of respect for each other that, you know, that's okay, let's go on to the next thing. And it doesn't mean you can't have a warm, lasting relationship with an individual who loves America, loves Colorado, loves his family just as much as I do. So thank you. I don't know if I ever thanked you, but thank you for that.
A couple little vignettes to follow on. Bob may or may not remember at that town meeting, I do, that within a few minutes I was being attacked because I hadn't stopped the war, even though I'd opposed it in the House. Both of the
I remember. I was grateful you were there.
So we were both taking incoming fire. Bob mentioned our important trip to a war theater, and there's the old saying that there are no atheists in foxholes. And I think the corollary is in a war zone, it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. It matters that you're an American. And although I had expressed strong point of view that it was a mistake, given we didn't know enough about Iraq to invade it, once the decision had been made, my point of view was that I was going to do everything I could to make that a successful intervention, including funding the war. And that was one of the
Back the troops.
Yeah,
Yep,
back the troops. And
Yep.
that was one of the pressures I felt, and there are people I respect who decided to vote against the funding to make a statement. But I just felt very strongly after listening to families and fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, uncles, wives who had loved ones serving, that they really felt that money would be cut off, and that the soldiers, the Marines, the sailors, the airmen that were there were going to not only face the threat of action and there wouldn't have the support they needed.
Yep.
Yeah. So now I hopefully Bob has given me a little bit of a break, because I said in the paper that I love the guy. He's wrong a lot of the time. And I told him he could use Bill Clinton's line, though, that Bob could say, I got a lot of friends who are Democrats. They're wonderful people. They're just wrong. And in the end, what you hear coming from us and Patty and from Charles is a sense of humor about all of this, which is really part of what's lacking right now. You don't hear much in the way of humor.
Nobody's laughing.
Nobody's laughing.
Nobody seems to be having a good time.
I mean, Mark Twain, famously wrote, "Suppose I was a member of Congress, and suppose I was an idiot, but I repeat myself." We could use a little bit more of that.
May I just ask, because we do know that your father's sense of humor was, well, that's pretty clear that has been passed on. Did your father have a merry sense of humor?
No.
No.
I love my dad, and I speak at length about my dad and the lessons I did learn from him. Humor was not one of them, no. He loved his work, and he worked very, very hard and very long, and survival was pretty important back then. But well, if you get me started on my dad, we'll be here a while.
Well,
he was part of that greatest generation, not because he went to the war, his brother did, but he did everything back here at the home front that needed to be done, and I miss him greatly. I'm sure Mark feels the same way. Dads are hard to replace. Moms and dads. Yep.
Please, Charles.
Mark, you mentioned your dad.
Hold the microphone really close.
Is it coming over now? Yes. Okay. And he was quite a raconteur, and his wonderful book, Too Funny to Be President, he made a good run, your dad did, but he came up close in the primary, but didn't make it. But he was a man with a great record in the House of Representatives, but also a sense of humor and of wisdom. And can you think of any things about him that would bear upon what we're talking about tonight?
Yeah, my father believed that humor was, and he used to, with a twinkle in his eye, use these words, it was a lubricant for social intercourse. And
I'm not going to go.
Of course, you have to remember he was brought up in a Mormon community, and his great-grandfather was a polygamist with at least 2 wives that we know of, but that's a whole nother topic. But I think my dad, he loved to tell many stories because he felt that's how you connected with people. And he would tell the story about territorial Arizona. Arizona is about the size of Colorado. It doesn't have the 64 counties we has. It only has about 13 counties, Bob. They're really big counties. And there was a Goldwater who was running for the county commission, and there was a Udall who was running for the county commission. Unfortunately, the Goldwater was the Democrat, and the Udall was the Republican. Of course, if you go to Arizona and look in the history books, the Udalls were accused of working both sides of the street. In other words, we had Republicans and Democrats placed everywhere. But the Goldwater and the Udall campaigned together, and they were driven around by young Barry Goldwater. And they'd get out and debate fiercely, and then they'd get back in the Model T and drive on to the next stop. But the Udalls were really conflicted. Who were they going to support? The Goldwater, who was the Democrat in my near and close family, or the Udall, who was the Republican. In the end, they supported the Udall, who was the Republican, because blood is thicker than Goldwater. But the moral of that was that in the West, and I think this is also where Bob and I commune, and we didn't check our clothing arrangements tonight, but we're Westerners. In the West, Mother Nature really rules supreme, and she presents us with these gorgeous landscapes. And I was out walking late today. The sunset here was phenomenal, as they often are, and a lot of opportunity. But she could also be a harsh mistress, and there was a pretty quick understanding that if we didn't work together, regardless of our political party, to be able to get our produce to market and educate our children and provide basic health care, we could be in a world of hurt. So when it really got down to it, the party affiliations and labels really weren't as important as working together. And I always felt that with Bob and his story, I think would amplify that and confirm that.
Well, and a big part of that, Mark, if I might add to it, it makes me think about what the job of a congressman really is. And before I got there, I didn't fully understand it, but an enormous amount of it is constituent service. You're taking care of the folks back home, and you're trying to fulfill some of the priorities of your district and your state. And some of those priorities are water and public lands and recreation and certainly education. And in my case, when I went there, it became obvious to me that not a member of the Colorado delegation was on the Transportation Committee. And yet, still the case today, we've got infrastructure, roads, bridges, that are in serious disrepair. I thought, well, I'll try to get on there, and fortunately I did. And this is another case where, I'm on that committee, but Mark, representing then the second district, of course, and other members of the Colorado delegation, we'd all put our heads together and say, all right, here's the priorities that CDOT, the state, has outlined. What can we get done? And because I was on the committee, I would run point. Mark was on natural resources, and over again, he ran point on public lands issues, water issues, environmental issues, mining issues. And that, I don't know if that kind of collegiality is working today, but it worked for us. And it worked very well for us. And again, I'll emphasize how well our staffs work together, because you're working for a common objective. And then we'd have legislation on the floor, and that's what would make the headlines, is that, maybe Mark voted no, I voted yes, or the other way around. But that is an important part of being a member of Congress. But it's not just about being a legislator or a policy wonk. And the other reality that quickly hits you right square between the eyes is that as a junior member, you're not going to be the king of writing the legislation. That's an institution that's all about seniority and who's been there the longest and who's the committee chairman. Those of us that are down the totem pole a rung or two or 10, our job really is to take care of the folks back home. And it's another place where I think we saw things very much similarly.
It's also a very rewarding area in how you serve and how you make a difference. There's a lot of focus on the flashy speech, the legislative initiatives that you brought forward, but where you can really make a difference day in and day out is that constituent service.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I just will say that I remember Maggie saying once how important constituent service was to you. I didn't know what that meant, and I thought, he seems like such a lively and interesting person. You'd think he'd have other enthusiasms than whatever that dreary thing is. But now, this is a TMI moment, but I was a victim of Social Security identity fraud recently. And thank the Lord, a friend said to me, go to get your congressman's help. I was going nowhere until I did that. So I just think, could I just see, maybe those of you don't make a show of yourselves, but just say whoop or something if you have been benefited by constituent services from a congressman. Woo, woo, right, okay, so, I mean, that wasn't the right sound probably when I think of it. I probably should have thought of some sort of, I don't know what that was. But it is an amazing thing.
Yeah, there's so many great examples, and it's what a public servant should do. Bob joined me to help a wonderful woman on the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park. Her name was Betty Dick. I don't know if you remember her. She had a little in-holding that's as you come down into that moose country off the Divide Road in Trail Ridge. And her husband had been gone for many years, and they had signed an agreement with the Park Service. At a certain point in time, she would vacate the property. Well, she was long-lived, and the Park Service, and I'm not one to go after bureaucrats. A bureaucrat's a Democrat who has a job the Republican wants, as the old saying goes, but or vice versa again, right?
You're on tonight.
But the Park Service was just, we were supposed to do this. They were going to evict this woman who opened her property all summer to festivals and conferences and youth groups. And Bob and I joined forces, and we were able to pass what's called a private bill out of the House. And I needed him because he was in the majority, and he was more than happy because this Betty was just such a wonderful woman. And she said to me, I don't know if you'll help me. I'm a Republican. I said, that doesn't matter. Let's go to work and get this right.
Perfect example of government overreach and just taking people completely out of it. So, yeah, that's an example of how we work together.
Did you, when you looked up at the, it's not called the scoreboard, but you saw the yeas and the nays and you saw that you were in opposition, did you sometimes follow up on that with a conversation? Or did
yeah,
you
well, I'm a man of faith, and when I look up there and see how Mark got it so terribly wrong, it gave me an opportunity to work on forgiveness. And he gave me a lot of opportunity.
If I had been really busy during the day, we want to go to this eventually, fundraising, which is way too much of what people's time is spent doing now. And I would get to the floor in a rush. I'd look up, and if Bob was red on the board, I'd vote green, and if he was green, I'd vote red. So I knew I had a touchstone.
Glad I could help, Mark. Keep your record pure.
Did anything ever test the friendship while you were in office?
I guess we both can't recall anything.
Yeah,
You're really looking blank.
I don't recall anything.
No, yeah, I don't, particularly on a personal level. You know, I might say, oh, okay, well, I'm not surprised Bob was there, or can we get Bob to join us on this? I know you did the same thing, but I don't remember anything that.
Well, you were kind enough to, you co-sponsored some of the legislation I had introduced.
Yeah.
We worked well together, and it can happen. And Mark and I maybe are a bit of an anomaly, especially in this day. But you mentioned Mike Feely earlier, and you know, Mike and I ran against each other in 2002, and it was the closest of 435 contests in the United States House that year. 121 votes, and took 5 weeks and recounts and all the money that poured into it. And Mark's been through those kind of races. And we threw everything at each other, including the kitchen sink. But we never lost respect for each other. In fact, when we see each other today, I don't know if you know this or not, but we do just like you and I. We give each other a big hug because we developed that sense of respect, that we were both in this for the right reason, the same reason, and somebody was going to win and somebody was going to be in second place. It's become so bloody personal today, And in my opinion, not just at the elected official level, the candidate level, but I think it's really a reflection on all of our society. The way I've come to characterize it, everybody's familiar with the bell curve, and on the political spectrum, you know, most people used to be in that bell, a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right of center, but most people were kind of in that big glob in the middle, the big bump. I think that bell curve has almost been inverted now, to where everybody has been pushed way to one side and way to the other side. And I mean, you want to get in trouble in this crazy business of politics today, at least in my party, I'll bet in yours too, is do something with somebody from the other party. And you come home and everybody's screaming at you, what'd you do that for? And you just bought yourself a primary. It's really a sad state of affairs, but I think it's reflective of how polarized all of society is, because you know, elected representatives are just that. They're representatives of the folks that sent them there. They'd like to be able to stay there, so they're continually playing, if I can put it that way, fair characterization, to their base.
Yeah, the secret is that members of Congress and the Congress itself doesn't often lead. We're actually reflecting where the country is. There are times when the Congress leads, and there are times when they're bold members of the Congress who really step out and put their political careers and their reputations on the line. John Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, is still one of the most remarkable books, I think, that delves into all of that. But I come tonight with no killer app or this great idea about how to meet the malaise and the division that bedevils us right now. And I know opening the floor to the audience can be really dangerous, but exciting. But I think part of the answer, if not a significant part of the answer, lies with the American people and what we do. I think Bob and I can speak as private citizens now, but is what we do to demand more of our elected officials.
I've got a grandson sitting here in the front row, my oldest grandson. He's a freshman here at CU. And he belongs, I think I've got it right, to a group that it's called Dialogue Initiative. And it's about what we're talking about here. People coming together and sharing different opinions, but still trying to maintain a degree of respect and decorum in their conversations. I think that's so healthy. And we're leaving you a whole lot to do, Jacob. A whole lot to do, a lot to repair.
The famous line from the former Commissioner of Agriculture from Texas, there's nothing in the middle of the road but a dead armadillo and a double yellow line. I mean, what would you like to do with that?
I'm trying to extend the metaphor because we need people in the we need people to work together. Maybe you don't stand there very long, but you come together in the middle of the night when there isn't much traffic, which might be the equivalent of working quietly in the back rooms. The smoke-filled rooms have gotten a bad rap, but Bob and I both saw this begin to happen. It used to be. Let me give you an example. I haven't talked to Bob, but I think he and I are both fiscal hawks. And I was a big supporter of the Simpson Bowles initiative. You know, our federal balance sheet's really distressed, and we're handing it off to the young people that are going to inherit this country. But there were people who got involved discussing that because there's some hard choices there. Probably some additional revenue through a simplification of the tax code, and a slowing of the growth of Medicare and Social Security and some of the programs that support the people in this country. But there were people in those negotiations that would run out to the press and say, hey, you know, so-and-so is going to sell you out. They're going to, that Democrat in there is going to sell you out on Social Security and Medicare. And then there'd be a Democrat that would say, you know, so-and-so is going to vote for tax increase. That Republican in there. And that kind of breaking of faith and undercutting the trust that you develop when you negotiate, that's a part of what's happening in Washington. And people don't know how to legislate anymore. They're great at giving press conferences and going on social media and doing all that, but legislation and legislating it's hard work. You have to build trust. It takes time. You got to find that common ground. You have to listen. There's not much of that happening. Well,
the other thing that I think is hard work, good phrase, and an accurate one. Our relationship seemed to come very natural. Again, Mark was very magnanimous in his invitation. We just got along well, and we just continued that relationship. I think we're both maybe that kind of people to begin with, and that certainly helps. But since we're throwing phrases around and old cliches and wisdoms, you know, it's said that it's easier to poison a well than to dig one. And there's a lot of truth in that too. And it's a lot easier just to be nasty and throw an invective at somebody else and just leave it there. Now we've got social media and we've got cable news 24 hours a day, and that's what seems to drive so much of that. And now you can do it kind of anonymously or behind a screen. Or there's something really missing in our culture right now, and I believe if we don't get it back, Jacob again, we've lost a good bit of the soul of what made America so exceptional in the first place. A sense of right and wrong, a sense of decorum, a sense of respect for other human beings and the dignity that they have simply because they are a fellow human beings, and Americans, by the way. And I hope I hope somehow we regain that. Maybe we've dug ourselves deep enough in the hole that we're ready to crawl back out.
If I might piggyback on
Please.
what Bob said, I think he diagnosed two of the main reasons we're in the situation we're in. The other two are linked. They're all linked, and they're operating in such a way that their downward spirals being created. The third element is the perpetual campaign. It used to be you'd campaign, and as I said in my opening remarks, we kicked the heck out of each other, but it would go on for 3 or 4 months, and it was over. Then we'd govern for 20 months. Now that formula is reversed. We kick the heck out of each other for 20 months, then we try and govern for 4 months. Don't forget that, again, to emphasize the point about elections, we've had fierce elections. The election of 1800, if you feel distressed or really worried, go look at that election. The two men who wrote the Declaration of Independence had such a bitter campaign, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. They didn't talk to each other for 10 years. It took a woman to get them to talk to each other, and that was Abigail Adams, as many of you remember. And then they restored their friendship, and there's the famous story. They both died on the 4th of July, 1824. And I forget which one of them was still living and said, is Jefferson or is Adams still living? And he was, but we didn't. Of course, we didn't have the internet and telephones. They didn't know. But that was a brutal campaign. It was so bitter, and yet the country moved ahead because there was a allegiance to let's govern. The other element, probably the biggest one for me, and it affects all the rest of it, is the incessant fundraising that goes on. And here's what it creates is, and I'll be frank, and it pains me and distresses me. But my last 2 years in the Senate, a day in Washington was this. I would get up, fight the time change, go to a fundraising breakfast. Then I would go to my office, get a short briefing, 10 or 15 minutes. Then I'd go across the street and start making fundraising calls with my specialized headset. Because, you cradle a phone all day, you begin to get crick in your neck. There might be a vote on the floor of the Senate. I'd run over and vote. I wouldn't have any time to stand on the floor of the Senate, visit with my colleagues, go back, make calls the rest of the morning. Then I'd go to a lunch fundraiser. Then I might get to go to a committee for 10 minutes and ask questions that I hadn't had time to actually develop myself. I was dependent on my staff, who are wonderful. Then I go back and fundraise, and then you know where I'm going. I might get an hour in the gym because I'm a Colorado and it's important to be fit, right? And in fact, there was a little story to me early on where it said I went to the gym every day for an hour, and Barney Frank, of all people, came to me and said, Mark, that's going to get you defeated, when people find out you get a little exercise for an hour. And I was a little bit taken aback, and I found myself, I said, Barney, you don't know Colorado. If I don't go to the gym for an hour a day, I'm not going to get reelected, right? And then I'd go off to fundraisers at night. So what's happening then is, in order to raise that money, you start to demonize the other team. You don't get to spend time with your colleagues, so you don't know them. They're strangers to you. And you don't have time for policy work. You don't have time to brainstorm on legislative initiatives. You don't have time to actually enjoy being in Washington, because it's a marvelous city. It's a historic city. It's an inspiring city when you have time to take it all in. And that's what everybody in Washington is doing now. And it's then you get to Thursday and you're like, well, when do we get to get out of here? Because I got to fly to Miami or Dallas or Chicago, and you fundraise Thursday night, Friday, fly home maybe late Friday night. Then you get one day at home to work to be in the district and hear about all the great things people are doing and be inspired. And then Sunday you're back on an airplane flying to New York or Chicago for your Monday morning fundraisers. That's what's going on, and that's a big part of why the Congress isn't working and why it's dysfunctional. I don't have the answer. There's a group of farmer members. I don't know if you're a member of it, Bob. There are about 200 former members across the reformers working inside the system, trying to find some ways that we can support to reform the campaign finance system. Thank you for indulging me talking that long, but this is at the heart of what's going on, I think.
So, Charles.
My students, of course, all their adult lives have seen the current situation only. And we talk about that in class and whether there was a time when it was better and if it can get better again. And the way I think of it, and I'm interested to see the two of you, we all kind of got involved in politics. I was never in elective office, but worked on a number of projects and of different kinds. And I'll just take the sort of the mid and late 70s. It was messy, and democracy in our country has to be messy with checks and balances. That's messy. Federal, state jurisdiction, that's messy. And so there's going to be that. But it really was, often I would not worry about what party the senator or congressman I was going in to talk to was from, but just to go in and have a conversation knowing that that person may well just be perfectly willing to go ahead. And so I would say that, in my view, there was a time not being romantic, but when things did generally work right, and the atmosphere was different, and it was different from today. And my question of you is, the two of you, is do you think that's true, that during your lifetimes you had seen the system and the society working generally pretty damn well? And if you think that, do you think it is realistic that we can go back and recover some of that? Are you optimistic that your grandson or son? Grandson is working on that maybe it can happen?
Well, it's a great answer after what Mark just had to say, or what I guess we both had to say, but about how we got in this pickle. I think you're correct in your original premise that there was a time when relationships were better. Bill Armstrong was one of my mentors, and he talked about when he first went back and was in those years. And he said he moved his family back there. Now, I don't know if you ever moved your family, but we didn't. Claudia, because when I served, the folks back home expected you to be there every weekend, like Mark just outlined. And so it's this continual back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And other than seeing some of the members in the gym, that was important to me. That's where I got to know some of my Democrat colleagues. And a little bit of interaction in committee work, but most of that even got pretty partisan. It was difficult to develop those relationships. Now, when Senator Armstrong said he served and they stayed there over the weekend, unthinkable in today's era. people expect you to be back home. You know, they'd socialize, they would visit, they'd be like real people with each other, and you could develop that kind of respect. I keep going back to that word, but I think that's a lot of it. That's our relationship. No, we don't agree on everything exactly, but we have mutual respect. That's what seems to be lacking, Charles. You asked, can we get there again? I hope and pray. As if I don't want to be overly melodramatic, but I mentioned earlier that we're losing our soul. Somebody I respect a lot tried to answer the question, what makes us so exceptional after all? And his name's Os Guinness, same family as the original brewer. In fact, I think he's a 5th or so generation descendant. And Oz says it's the golden triangle of freedom. We all know about freedom, and we as Americans subscribe to an ordered liberty. But he says in order to keep that ordered liberty, you have to have a virtuous people, people that believe in a sense of right and wrong and do unto others as you'd have done unto you, and some of those absolutes. And in order to maintain that kind of virtuous people generation after generation after generation, it's got to be bigger than yourself. It can't be about just this moment, this second in history. It has to be that we want to pass it on to the next generation a little better than we got it, right? And that requires some faith, a faith in that we know that where things came from. That's where those unalienable rights came from. It was from our Creator, not from a monarch or somewhere else. So I'm giving you all that walk down memory lane, but freedom requires virtue, virtue requires faith. That kind of faith requires a system of governance that will maintain and sustain that kind of ordered liberty. I'm afraid that we're losing a couple of the points of that triangle right now. And even the freedom point of that triangle, I think in many minds is really, I just don't want anybody to mess with me, and I want to be able to set my own rules. Our society won't function that way. I think there's a lot at stake right now, and if we don't get a grip on what it means to be exceptional Americans, I'm concerned that we might fail Ben Franklin's test. We gave you a republic if you can keep it. I think he was prescient when he said that. He knew that republics typically did not last very long, and I don't want to be part of a generation that caused it to go the wrong direction.
Charles, we have to get it right, and I believe we will. Easy to say. There are days when I'm not so sure. I'd share Bob's concerns in it. If you look back at history, I think history is still a great teacher and an important teacher. It wasn't a given we were going to come out of the Civil War in the way we did. It wasn't a given that World War II would see us successful. It wasn't a given that we'd find our way after the turmoil of the 60s. And I apologize to your grandson. I get about the baby boomer cohort, and we've worked awful hard. We criticized our parents in many respects, and we talked about the society that was handed off to us. And in some respects, we've done an amazing job. In other ways, we're handing off a really difficult situation. I know the younger generations, they've got a term that they say, "Okay, boomer," and it's a pejorative, not a compliment. But you and I and
don't give him any ideas.
Okay.
I've given him enough material.
ideas. But yeah, we're still in this fight. We're still in this debate, and I know we all had turbulent relationships with Senator McCain, but he had a great way of structuring and explaining what motivated him, and that was he believed that in order to build his self-respect, he had to dedicate himself to a cause greater than his own self-interest. And I think, Bob, that's what you just put your finger on. And democracies are ailing all over the world. That provides a little bit of solace, a little bit of understanding. There's some big questions that no democracy's really been able to answer. in a way that's settled down the population in those countries and given them a sense of security. Income inequality is huge. The changing economic situation we find ourselves in. And yet we're living in a time when, by most metrics, we're the most fortunate humans ever to populate the surface of the planet. So there are these conundrums and big cross currents. You know where I and I'll end on this note, and I may mention it later too, because I think this is where I take a lot of my optimism. Is I believe and I know local governments, county governments, state governments are still in many respects working quite well, and they're the laboratories of experimentation. It's where there's a lot of people who are really putting their shoulders to the wheel, trying to find those solutions, listening to their constituents. And after all, the Revolutionary War didn't start in Washington, D.C. With the federal government. It started in all these towns up and down the eastern seaboard when people said, you know, we think we can do a better job than the king. We know it's going to be difficult. We're going to diffuse the power. We don't want we don't want a king. You know, although I'd love to be king for a week, man, I could get some stuff done. You should not.
That's called a dictator, Mark.
Bob and I, we should compare notes for you all what we do in a week. That's when you might really see the differences.
Yeah, I've got my list.
Although probably we each on the top of our list would be that we're gonna declare that we're king for a month, not just a week. That would be the
week's not nearly enough.
First thing we do. But part of the other thing is the American public doesn't quite understand, as I think many of us growing up did, that part of the frustration is we diffused power so we wouldn't have a king, and that leads to stalemate, and it leads to people disagreeing in ways that mean there's any movement on policy fronts. And in the Congress in particular, it's really been compounded by the factors we've shared with you tonight, and many of you are aware of.
I asked Patty for permission to. They're not asking many questions. We're just kind of rolling with it up here. Good. But Mark makes me think. He mentioned that for the most part, you look around and local governments, state governments, seem to be working pretty well, and I think that's a very good observation. And maybe there's a little wisdom in that. The founders, of course, put together a system, federalism it was called, that the federal government was supposed to be relatively weak, and they defined what the federal government's limits were, and then that 10th Amendment, everything not specifically mentioned was supposed to be at the states. Well, we, all of us collectively, I think over our 200 plus years now, have gradually transferred, sometimes the federal government takes it, but we've allowed them to take it, more and more and more power, authority to the federal government and less to state and local. Absolutely the opposite of what I think the founders in their wisdom gave us. We've got a couple of examples. Mark mentioned some local government. I've not to a great degree, but I've had a little bit of an opportunity to look at the Western Governors Association, and that is maybe an all too rare example of where you can get in a room with all those governors, some Democrat, some Republican, some pretty far left, some pretty far right, but when they start talking about Western issues, massive amounts of public lands, as you know very well, Mark, a lot of water issues in the West, environmental issues, mining issues in the West, transportation issues in the West. You can't tell the ones with a D from the ones with an R, and that's pretty healthy. When I've fantasized about maybe being a governor,
you got close to the dismay of a lot of people in this room that night. And Bob and I, we share a lot. We both lost that night, so we
did. We have another thing in common.
And that sucked.
Yeah, I wasn't happy. I don't know. Losing is no fun. Second place, you don't even get a trophy. Not a red ribbon, nothing. Anyway, one of the objectives I had when I was in that frame of mind was to maybe work with other governors to try to claw back a little bit of that authority for the states, which I think would be pretty healthy. I think they are, Patty, the laboratories of democracy, and sometimes they get it right and sometimes they get it wrong, but If we sit back, I don't mean to pick on the federal government. It's easy to do, but if we sit back and wait for Washington to get it right, we're going to be waiting a while. We're going to be waiting a while.
I have a great deal of respect and admiration, even affection for some people we served with. On the other hand, I see that they're still there occasionally, and I'm like, oh my goodness.
I published a book in 2009, and I was bold enough to say, well, and here's an agenda for America. Here's the stuff that needs to be fixed. It's all still there. I mean, 10 years later, it's all still there. But some of it's gotten worse.
Yeah,
I mean, we haven't addressed the border, and Mark mentioned the national debt, which is absolutely criminal. And there's a lot of work to be done. Still work,
yeah. But that old saying that the sum is greater, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Right now, the sum is less than the sum of the parts. The whole is less than the sum of the parts in D.C. And there are a lot of there are 535 people there who are getting up, almost all of them every day, trying to make a difference, and nothing's happening. So I'm not holding my breath for great policies out of Washington, and it pains me to say that, but I have a lot of faith in the states and in the counties and in the cities. And that's not to say that just take a look here at Boulder, or Louisville, or Lafayette. There's some pretty heated battles on those city councils, but so far, for the most part, using your verb earlier, they haven't been poisoned to the extent Washington has bipartisanship. It's coming, and the other area Bob and I might riff on is the political consulting class, and where in many respects that class has taken us. Again, a lot of good people who wanted to make a difference also saw a way to make a living, and it's become a full-time,
pretty good living,
full-time industry. I mean, we'd raise all this money, and then it goes in about 2 weeks onto TV, and the media consultant and the general consultant, they're getting 5, 7, 8% of that, and you're putting 10, 12, $15 million in TV. Do the math.
Win or lose.
Win or lose, yeah.
Win or lose.
We're just cannon fodder.
Yeah.
And look, I have, if I have regrets about my 2014 campaign, which I'm critical of, it's that all that fundraising I described to you didn't leave me much time or energy or insight into be involved in the strategy in my campaign. And maybe I'd have done worse if I'd involved in that. But I got to think I would have at least said we're losing touch, and even I'm using this phrase points to what I'm just saying. We're losing touch with my brand. People haven't been reminded of that I'm a Coloradan through and through, that I'm comfortable in any part of the state. Put me on a farm, put me in a ski area, put me in a boardroom in Denver. I'm going to be comfortable and going to be there listening and working on behalf of Colorado. Sorry for that riff, but I had to go there.
We have that in common too.
So I wanted to say the Western Governors Association is a very important group, in my opinion. And we, with Jim Ogsbury, the executive director's permission, we have lifted their slogan. The bumper stickers for Western Governors Association is "Bipartisanship happens." So, Jim was really, really kind about lending us that name, and he's also told me, I don't think I'm violating anyone's confidence on this, but that this didn't seem probable to me, but apparently it's true, that Steve Bullock and Butch Otter are very good friends, which the former governor of Idaho and the governor of Montana, who was running for president but isn't anymore. So I happen to be at the Western Governors Association. I just think it's got that human reality of these folks are just hanging out, and I wasn't totally thinking that I was enjoying Butch Otter's personality that much. I had only seen him in front of a group, I guess. I'll just say that.
We love Butch Otter. He's sui generis, one of a kind.
He is that.
Unique.
And yeah, so what turned me around completely on my Butch Otter positioning, so I happened to be eavesdropping, and I don't think I'm violating confidence with this, but the governors were supposed to go into a room for sequential press conferences. Butch Otter started into the room. His staff people said, "Oh no, Governor, you're supposed to sit out here and wait because Governor so-and-so is in there and you go in 5 minutes, or maybe more." So he sits down and he's sitting next to the door where he's gonna go. And I've just happened to be in the vicinity. I was not part of that conversation, but I heard him say, "This is like waiting for confession." And then he waits another minute or so, and then he says, "Well, I guess I could review my sins." And in terms of good staff relations, I think this is really great. His staff member says instantly, when he says, I guess I could review my sins, the staff member says, we don't have that much time, Governor.
That staffer knew the same Butch I know, yeah.
Yeah, right. So thank heavens for the Western Governors Association, which really does hold to that. And that does mean they skip over some issues where they might not keep that agreement. But it is certainly the state's.
I'm biased, but I think the politics in the Rocky Mountain West are the healthiest in the country because of what you've described, Bob's described, Charles.
It's not biased, that's fact.
Great.
Yeah,
It's
right.
fact.
I think you're right.
It's fact.
Could you speak a little bit more about that and how, in fact, maybe Colorado might have, at least episodically, a claim on the purple status that might be an inspiration to other parts of the
You know, I might
nation?
be a heretic here, but the best churches, of course, are looking for converts, not for heretics. But we need two strong political parties. We need two healthy political parties. We need the competition in the policy space, and we need the competition that different personalities and different visions present. And I think in many respects, we have that in Colorado. Now, my team's doing a little better the last couple of cycles, but was testing Bob there, seeing how he'd respond. But
I've been paying attention.
but we can't get arrogant, get cocky, get complacent. Remember, I served the one term in the state legislature, and a few cycles later, the Democrats began to have some real results in the state legislature, and the population was changing a little. But I think some of the Republican leadership in the state House and state Senate, they'd been in that position for many, many decades, and they just thought it was going to continue to be that way.
Oh, they did. Yeah,
And I think they brought you in to try and fix that situation.
that went well. You know, on that, you make a very good point about Colorado, and thanks for bringing up our home state. I think there is a risk, and you know, your party's in control now, so I'll say there's a risk for your party, but a risk for the state, really, in that we are becoming this urban corridor of which we're sitting in tonight. You know, we've always had some of that dynamic in Colorado, where rural Colorado wondered if Denver ever really knew we were out there. Well, Denver's a whole lot bigger than just the city and county of Denver now. The metropolitan area that has become so heavily populated, and we've got an us and them going on in Colorado, more than I've witnessed in my lifetime anyway. And I think that's risky if we really love this state. We're going to have to figure out how to resolve that too. That there's more dialogue, more cooperation, more understanding than I think currently exists.
I couldn't agree more. There was a governor, Johnny Vanderhoff, who took office when John Lowe was appointed into the Nixon cabinet as energy secretary. And he was asked, Johnny Van from Grand Junction, he was asked what the best thing about Denver was, and he said, seeing it in the rearview mirror. You remember that? I think Dick Lamb beat him but Bob's right on, and I guess to broaden the conversation to the national scene, when I was running for re-election, I was excited to think about serving 6 more years, and one of the vows I made to myself is I literally and figuratively was going to get to the 4 corners of Colorado, the southeast, the northeast, the northwest, and the southwest, which are rural, farming, ranching parts of the state. And I was beginning to sense this divide that Bob's describing. And I think it is one of the ways in which you if you're an elected official, public servant, you lead, you get out and listen, you show up, and you go to places where it's uncomfortable. And I would urge the leadership in this state to do that as much as they can. And look, there aren't a lot of votes out there, and if you get your consultants telling you don't waste your time, then ignore them, because the job is bigger than just generating those votes come every 4 years, every 6 years, every
Yeah, and then when you do have the responsibility of governing, you'd better well understand what's going on outside your little neighborhood, regardless of how many people live in that little neighborhood. This is a big state, and it's a magnificent. I'll bet you were just like me when I campaigned statewide. I loved getting around this state because it is magnificent.
my heart was broken in any way losing in the 14 election, I didn't get to travel the state in the ways that I got to travel the state, even though I'd taken a 2-year hiatus to raise money. But the follow-on with that is all of us, I think, have a responsibility to find ways to engage with, from my party's point of view, with Trump supporters. And I don't know what the equivalent in Bob's party is. I do know that I was surprised to hear on a number of occasions that the way we feel about President Trump, a lot of Republicans felt about President Obama. And that's astonishing to me. And my first reaction, you got to be out of your frickin' mind. But their point of view and their perspective is they're a voter, they're an American. And there's got to be more of that getting out of your own echo chamber. That we're all in our own echo chambers. And I really noticed that when I left the Congress it's great to go to the church and hear a sermon that's right up your alley, in which you totally agree with. It's a lot tougher to go to that setting where people really have a different worldview. And rural America is really where much of what we venerate originated.
Absolutely.
Thomas Jefferson,
Yep.
the New Englanders. It was tied to that rural
Yep.
that rural lifestyle and those rural values. And so there's a real danger here of losing that connection.
Yeah, as you were talking, and I was thinking about the state of affairs in society again in general, talking now specifically about Colorado. I think Patty says we need to do, what is it, respiration?
Respiratory protest.
Respiratory protest.
Yes.
Maybe we could also take a little advice from Paul McCartney. Once in a while,
well, I
just
don't know.
let
Some
it
advice,
be.
no. There,
Just
no.
let it be.
Oh,
And it seems like today that nobody can let it be. You've got to
Yeah,
fire
yeah.
off a message on Twitter or Facebook or
yeah.
someplace and file your protest. And you're talking about Trump and Obama, and I think they are similar.
That's all right.
I think it's. Oh, did you lose control? But when
I'm breathing. I'm respirating.
Okay,
That's what I'm
please
doing.
do.
That's what I'm doing.
please do. I can hear you. I can hear you. Go ahead, Patty.
Well, I guess no, don't stop, because that's not what we came to do.
What you're paying me for, I ought to at least follow the rules.
Well, I do have 2 questions. Thank you, Kurt has brought me some questions, and they do go in that direction. Well, if what you were saying was that intense reactions from people who oppose them were similar, that's, I think, where you were going before I began respirating over here, if that's...
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going, but we don't have to go there.
I have no, if I renew my membership in the American Civil Liberties Union every year, because I sometimes do ask for civility, and I do sometimes interrupt someone to say, could you rephrase that so that we could understand your point, and so on. So I occasionally interfere with free speech in the interest of civility, and I want the ACLU forced to defend me because I have a membership. So that is the strategy of my membership dues, but I would not choose at this moment to violate your free speech rights in the First Amendment. So you should speak.
Well, I've almost lost the train of thought that I was
That's
going to
my
go.
hope. That was exactly my plan. This is worked
Yeah,
out
it
really
worked.
well.
It worked. It worked.
Well, and in fact, maybe I could say that I do have these 2 questions here. Do you feel tweeting is compromising dialogue and undermining civility? And here's another one. We have heard the most incendiary rhetoric from the President of the United States in the last 3 years. How are we supposed to overcome that kind of speech and reestablish the bonds of civility and common shared citizenship?
Yeah, that's fair. He has a habit of pouring gas on a fire, and it just baffles me. But he is who he is, and I'll use the current president to make the point that I tried to make earlier, that I think he is, in my opinion, he is but a symptom of the problem. He's not the source of all the problem. I mean, he got elected because I had a cousin who took me to school on this. He wanted a fighter. He wanted somebody that wasn't like all the other ones. He wanted somebody that was different and going to shake it up, and he dang sure has done that. and he is a fighter. I mean, he can't resist punching down. And I wish he'd put the Twitter thing away too. But again, I think if we want to point to him as the source of the problem, I think we've got it upside down. He got elected, and he is playing to a base pretty clearly, and a big share of that base loves what he's doing. That's part of the problem, in my opinion, is that if we love fighting for fighting's sake, and we ought to be principled, and we ought to believe strongly in what we hold dear to us, and we ought to be willing to stand up and debate that, Jacob. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's very, very healthy. But at the end of the day, we ought to take a lesson. I didn't know him. I wish I did. But we ought to take a lesson from all the stories we've all heard about Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. Fight tooth and nail all day long, and then afterwards go have a cold one. And enjoy each other's company and tell their crude Irish jokes. Would that we could do that today. I don't think, I know we're not there. We're not there in Washington, D.C. And again, I think Washington, if you take anything home from tonight from what I've said, I think we've got to look not just at Washington and the problems that are pretty obvious there. They stare us in the face every day if you turn on television or open the newspaper. But what's going on in all of our society? Society sent all those people back there, and they're behaving pretty much like the folks back here want them to behave when they come home, or at least enough of them to get them elected. They're looking for that 50+1 to keep their job, and they're playing pretty hard to a very polarized base. And I don't think that's very healthy.
So,
I
please, yeah.
appreciate Bob sharing that and putting himself on the line. I'm continuously horrified, angered, amazed at what the president says, and in some cases what he does. But I do believe he's a symptom of what the cross currents, the dynamics in our society. And he having said that, hopefully, I may get skewered too now, but he's no different than he's always been. I mean, he's doing just what he's done for however many years he's been a businessman with 25 bankruptcies, by the way. But that's the only shot.
Now.
But it comes back to the all of us and the country saying we understand we're in this place. We've dug a deep hole. Can we unring some of these bells? Can we go back to a civil, decent, golden rule kind of discourse? And I have a lot of faith in the younger generations, and I have some faith in all of us, to boomers as well. But
Actually, I'm encouraged. When I was here in the late '60s, when Claudia and I were here, it was a little different then. And I don't recall these the deep, thoughtful discussions that he and his friends are having now. I am. If I'm optimistic of anywhere, it's that I can look at this next generation coming up, and I am encouraged. I think all hope is not lost. In fact, I think it might be alive and well.
The Winston Churchill, who was a conservative MP and prime minister, and much has been written about him. He wrote much, and he had a number of great sayings and stories you hear about him. But he famously said, and by the way, he was half American. You may remember his mother was American. He said, "You always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." And I know many of you've heard that, but there's a lot of truth to it. And I again, if I look at history, and I can refer to Tocqueville and other observers of America. De Tocqueville back in the 1830s, and it's still very relevant today. And he didn't get it all right, but he's equally critical of the nascent United States of America as he is complimentary. But he talks about America's strength being her capacity to acknowledge her mistakes and rectify those mistakes. And what he was saying was most of the other, if not all the other countries in the world didn't have that capacity. And I think that's the opportunity for us, is to support the young people, support people who are engaged, acknowledging the mistakes that have been made, to minimize the personalizing of it, and then let's move forward in the way America always has. But it's not a given. We're gonna find that way.
De Tocqueville also made the keen observation, and I think the right one, that America is great because her people are good. And I think at our core we are still good people, and I just wish we could find it within ourselves, and I've been guilty of this too. I need to go to confession as well, I guess. But we need to think a little bit more about the things that unite us, the things that we agree on, not quite as much about just those few, and sometimes they're pretty subtle things we disagree on, and think about building up, not just tearing down.
So I knew this would happen, that you guys just would chat and it would be great. I knew that. And yet I wrote all these questions anyway, which are now going to go into an
Put
archive.
them in the mail.
Well,
Send them to us.
and now I'm the voice of the people, because now I have the questions from the
Okay,
people.
yeah.
So I am going to ask a couple of those.
Great.
Oh, sorry, Mark, did you?
No, go ahead. No, I was
Well, but
trying
it
to be
was so-
respectful and not start telling more stories.
I don't know why you would do that, because it has been wonderful to have you pay no attention to your interrogators here and just.
But I did say I want to hear from the audience with some trepidation,
Well,
so I'd love
do
to hear
have some
questions.
questions from the
Is
audience.
that good with you? Yeah.
I'll do the two I have here. I'm going to do a little prelude of referring to the really interesting economist Robert Heilbronner, who wrote a book, I think in the late 1970s, called An Inquiry into the Human Prospect. And much of it was pitched to asking Americans to think about posterity. Then he went around the country lecturing on his concerns, many of his concerns, environmental issues and long-term well-being, and he then wrote the new conclusion to the paperback version, and the title of that was what he felt he had heard from many audiences he traveled around. That was, I guess, in the early 80s, and that new conclusion was called, "What Has Posterity Ever Done for Me?" So that's a little bit of the Heilbronner framework for these two questions. How do we heal the partisan divide on climate change so we can have a coherent policy and set of attitudes? And climate and energy are issues that seem to divide Americans more than they unify us. What is one element of the climate energy conversation that you think Democrats are missing? What is one element that you think Republicans are missing?
You going to take the Democrat question?
I don't know. I don't want to take both of them and have you just
Yeah, you
listen.
go ahead. I'll be a lot better off if I don't open my mouth.
You know, I was thinking about that on my little walk this afternoon, and that cold, crisp air that we enjoyed today. And because I thought it might come up, because I think it is obviously a very important question. It's an existential question and challenge for a lot of people. Sitting down with my Republican friends, I would, if they would give me 15 minutes, I'd quickly walk through the science. And then though, I would go to the opportunities for new energy technologies, and talk on an economic level. And this, I want to tell some stories about working with Republicans. One that was a lot of fun and it was substantive was Lola Spradley, who was the Speaker of the State House, and I teamed up in 2004 to co-chair the Amendment 37 campaign, which created a renewable portfolio standard in Colorado. And I think it was 15%. We're now at, I think, 50% under Governor Ritter. And Lola said to me very early on, she said, "Mark, if you talk about climate change, I'm going to strangle you." And I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah, we got to be talking about eco-devo." And I said, "Lola, that sounds like a Boulder term. Eco-devo?" She said, "Economic development. This is all about rural Colorado, taking advantage of the sun and the wind and the biomass that's so abundant here. And the road to energy independence leads right through rural America." And so we campaigned together. We had a lot of fun. We got an RV. We did a couple of press conferences where we'd say we're in bed together. We're in the back of an RV. and and we could, yeah, now you'd get in trouble, right? Well, my dad once said when he he went to bed in Wisconsin running for president, and he woke up and he lost after he'd won. When he went to bed, he said the voters have spoken, the bastards. And it wasn't ad hominem. It was a generic reference to everybody, and people loved it. We've lost that now, right? But at any rate, what I'm saying is find that common ground, and yes, I be forthcoming. I wouldn't be forthcoming and say I'm frustrated that the Republican Party in general seems to be resisting what the science shows us. Those very scientists that are giving us new knees and phones that are like computers and the capacity to travel across the country in 4 hours are saying, look, we're pumping gases into the atmosphere, which is limited, and we need to do something about it. And here's some of the ways we increase our national security, and we reduce our dependence on foreign oil, and we create jobs. Let's go for it on those grounds. And if the science is faulty, it's a no regrets approach. We need to do all this anyway, and if somehow the science is wrong or partially wrong, completely wrong, we've at least done what the future looks like it offers to us. But that's how I would approach it. I wouldn't come in there wagging my finger and trying to shame or to put a beat down on the people with whom I fundamentally disagree.
This is a good place to, and then I'll get directly to your answer, but this is a good place to talk about another area where Mark and I could work together. We probably would not be voting for the same energy bill in Congress, but when it came to NREL, it was very easy for us to cooperate on funding for the National Renewable Energy Lab down in Golden, which was in your district until it was in my district.
You took it away from me. That's part of why I showed up in Arvada,
those
'cause
map
I wanted to see if
makers
I
made
could get
it.
it back.
Now for the Republicans and Democrats on the sticky issue of climate change. To my Democrat friends, I hear often that the science is closed. It's all concluded and it's done. That frustrates me a bit because my understanding of science is that it never really is concluded, that it's always developing and we're always learning. And I would just ask that let's make sure we keep open minds, and if we do have more data, better data, new information, that we're at least open to that. To my Republican friends, I would bring up a kind of an obvious Western value that I know we share, that we ought to be better stewards of the environment that we've been blessed to be part of, and to be given a little bit of responsibility in this little moment in time to look after. And I'm afraid that this whole discussion of climate change, maybe it might be as good a poster child as we have right now for how so much of society and the parties seem to have just pushed clear to the sides. It's all one way or all the other. And there is, I think I'll say again the word stewardship. If we think about it in that context, don't pretty much all of us agree we ought to be good stewards of this wonderful place that we've been blessed to call home? And I think if we could at least agree on that and call that our common ground, then maybe we could start having productive discussions together. But it's really gotten so polarized. Thank you. It's really gotten so bitterly polarized.
We'll continue this conversation over dinner, and I'll push Bob gently and say, okay, we continue to watch the science, but what can we do in the meantime to take advantage of?
And that's a fair discussion.
Yeah.
So we are, this is so excellent as an event that I'm going to say that we should stay here for 2 more hours. And no, I'm not. I'm not. Oh, everyone thought I was serious. Oh, dear me, that's bad. No, I would love to do that because we certainly have that. But I think we're down to our last 2 questions, and Charles will have the last question, and then you can also have a minute or 2 for whatever it was that you think, oh, I should have said, and get that in there. But Charles will be. But I'm making an executive decision here. I have several questions on impeachment, And I'm not going to ask those because I want to ask about another subject that so rarely comes up when we're having these discussions. And Center of the American West really tries and tries and tries to keep it in the discussion. So I'm going to ask you about Indian people. I'm going to ask you about your time in Congress and tribal sovereignty and attempts to do the right thing by Indian people. So sorry, the first two letters are not that far apart, impeachment and Indians, but Indian people, I just think that so often does not figure in our conversations, and I want to make sure that we have your thoughts on that.
I grew up spending almost every summer from the age of 8 till I was almost 20 in the Four Corners region of the Southwest. My grandfather on my mother's side was the concessionaire in Rocky Mountain National Park and in Glacier National Park, and he owned those lodges with the Stanley brothers, and in so doing interacted a lot with Indian country. So my mother came up with that knowledge and that respect for those communities. My father, on the Mormon side I alluded to earlier, he was my Udalls were farmers, so I think again that's maybe Bob and I have some kind of carryover in that way. But my dad grew up in the little town of St. John's. It's on the Little Colorado River near the Painted Desert, and it was close to Hopi. Of course, the Navajo Reservation is the biggest and the most vast in the country, and it's the largest tribe. And my dad and his family, in part because the Mormons were persecuted, driven across the country, had an ethos that you stand with people who've been treated poorly, whether intentionally or not. People have been oppressed, people have been persecuted. So at our dinner table, we stand with the American Indian population. We stand with the Jewish community. We stand with the Catholic community, and we never forget where we came from. We never forget the Bill of Rights. And not to be immodest, but I believe I've carried that tradition forward with the help of people like Charles Wilkinson and God bless David Getches. My wife Maggie worked at NARF and she had taught on the Hopi Reservation as a young woman, and there's a lot of injustice. We all know the story, but having said that, we can immerse ourselves in that, or we can look forward. And I see a lot of that happening in Indian country. There's a lot of exciting things developing. There's a long way to go, but it's. We can be beset by guilt as we should be in some respects, but that can paralyze us. Let's continue, and I'm really being careful here that I'm not patronizing, but let's work to provide the tools, particularly the younger Native Americans who are really seizing their tribal governments, they're seizing economic opportunities, they're using the internet, they're using all those the 21st century tools to really begin to lift the prospects of their people, and that's something that ultimately, hopefully, we can be proud of as a nation, that we acknowledged our enormous mistakes, the human rights violations and all that came with what we did as Europeans, but we've working as a society to move to create a better future, to support those communities again, because when they're engaged in driving the decisions, that's the most powerful opportunity. That's the most powerful tool that they have. Not being told by the quintessential white man, this is what you do. This is how you improve your lot. And there's a lot of exciting things happening in that regard.
Well, this is an area where I feel a little inadequate given the company I'm in up here. Certainly you, Patty, and Charles, and Mark, with what you just shared. Me and my family, we just never had the opportunity to interact a lot with the Native Americans, with any of the tribes, and representing 3 urban counties when I was in Congress. I didn't have a reservation in Jefferson County. So I didn't have the responsibility. Certainly, if I been governor, that would have changed. But being a little bit of a student of history, and I say that modestly, given the company I'm in, I am a very proud American, and I wave the flag. But let's be honest. What we as Americans did, and how we treated the people that were here first is a pretty shameful part of our history. And I am very embarrassed about that. And Mark, you articulated it well. There's much that we might not be able to fix all of the past sins, but maybe we can fix some things going forward. So when I was in Congress, it was an interest of mine, and I remember co-sponsoring some legislation that unfortunately did not go very far. And now that we're in the buffalo business, I don't know if you read that part of my biography or not, but we're at our ranch. My son, who looks after it full time, up there, he and his wife, shortly after we arrived and had the first buffalo on the land, we had a couple of tribal members come, and they just wanted to see him. And they were so impressed and in awe of those magnificent beasts and they extended an invitation. They said, if you'd like, we'd come out and do a traditional tribal blessing of the ranch and the buffalo, and that was quite something to see. Now, our little nascent association, the National Bison Association, which happens to be headquartered here in Colorado, we are working with many of the tribes to repopulate the tribal lands with buffalo from our ranchers' herds. So it's that part's pretty healthy, and it's pretty real. You were talking about things we can do, and I think that's one. And that's healthy for the environment. It's certainly healthy for the tribes, and it just seems like the right thing to do.
Well, I'm looking forward to learning more about all of that and the spiritual traditions that Native people have. They're not some quaint little set of practices that we can indulge. We think we can indulge the Native people and show some sort of cursory respect. There's real power in those traditions, and we talk about preserving ecosystems of all kinds, because that's paying it forward, that stewardship. But there are also cultural ecosystems that I think at great risk do we lose those. And there's a wonderful book, The Wayfarers. I don't know if you ever read it. It's by Wade Davis, and he chronicles some of the traditional cultures that have this amazing connection with the natural world. For example, the Polynesians, who in a short time frame, probably less than 600 to 800 years, populated that enormous area of Polynesia from New Zealand to Hawaii to Easter Island. It's a triangle that's the largest on the face of the earth. And they did it without sextants, without GPS, without modern materials, but they had navigators who had a sense of the ocean. They could read the smells and the seaweed and the birds. And did all of them make it to the islands they were heading towards? No. But they were driven by this gene that many of us have, which is to explore, to look over the horizon. We ought to preserve those in the most important form of enlightened self-interest, as well as respect for those cultures. And by the way, Charles has worked tirelessly on this all over the world, not just here. So thank you, Charles.
Charles will ask the last question. Use your,
You mentioned that, but I feel there has been so many good words spoken tonight, and I think everybody in the room understands that and appreciate what you two have done tonight. And so I'd like to just let it sit there. I mean, we really have had a terrific set of discussions tonight.
yes, okay. But I guess I would like to go, if I could, just with one step further. I will go to bed very happy, and the heater is back on, so that's going to be a big part of that. But I also just will go to bed a little bit sad if we don't do the Setting the American West thing here and give these folks a standing ovation.